but we're pushing it to Bureau B. And finally, in the least sort of ambitious kind of governance change, are we layering, which is extremely common in the American system, which is Bureau A has authority, and now we create another bureau that also has overlapping authority, but the original bureau doesn't go away. Now they're going to fight with each other, and they have different sort of interests and values and cultures, and they're going to clash. And we do have this new bureau, but we haven't actually eliminated the old bureau that has a long history in this area and has stakeholders and has expertise and has ties to reporters and all sorts of things. And now we can see all the organizational frictions and conflicts that we're going to have, because it's usually very hard to eliminate that first bureau. It's much easier to just create a new one, but this is not a fair fight. Okay, and so the questions that we must ask ourselves when we are thinking about, has governance changed? Does this reform have prospects that are positive going forward? How extensive or limited are these shifts? How permanent or ephemeral? And how do the shifts that we see interact with surrounding authority, with all the other power centers that are in that arena? How are they going to interact? Are they going to reinforce each other? Are they going to be complementary? Are they going to clash? Are they in the same cycle? Right? Do they have similar or overlapping lines of authority, and so on? And so to give one little example here, one of the cases I looked at was part of the sort of new public management in the United States, performance management. This was part of the Clinton administration and Al Gore trying to make the American bureaucracy more customer-centered, more efficient, and there was a lot of changes in the procurement process, the way in which the federal government in the United States buys goods and services from private contractors to try to make it more business-like. And what we saw that one of the reasons why there was the desire for reform was the American procurement process had been very litigious, which was if you were a private firm and you lost out on a contract bid, you'd sue, right? This is America. We sue when somebody gives us a bad look. We take them to court, you know. Lawyers have all the power in America. And what we saw was a displacement, trying to displace the bid protests where that would occur from one agency to another. There was an effort by the reformers to say, well, we think this agency is very friendly with the litigation bar, the contract litigation bar. Let's keep that authority to protest and use judicial process, but take it out of that agency and go to another one. But we also saw a layering, and that is we created this very business-like, less red tape, less heavy regulated procurement system, but we put it on top of the existing civil service system. And the civil servants didn't have the training or the resources or the capacity or the incentives to really carry out the new system. So yes, we changed public policy, but we actually didn't change the state capacity to administer the policy in a way that was going to be as robust. And so and what we certainly didn't do was change Congress's incentives, the way in which they oversee the procurement process. And so we layered a high discretion, performance-oriented purchasing system atop an understaffed civil service and traditional oversight mechanisms focused not on good performance, but on the rooting out of fraud, waste, and abuse. There was a lot of political tensions there between those. So one thing, as I mentioned, we need to look at institutions and governance, but we also have to look at the reactions of private social actors, of businesses, of families, of citizens, because in the end of the day, they are the actors that generate support. They determine what government does, right? And so there's the key question always of, well, how do private actors react to what government is trying to do? And recent political science research has shown that public policies are not merely the outcomes of political forces, but they can also cause politics, right? When a public policy is very robust, it can change the way in which citizens vote and change the way citizens conceive of politics, can change the way they organize. Those can be very, very powerful effects indeed. And when policies do have very strong feedback effects, when they remake alignments and they remake voting patterns and they remake coalitions, their very existence influences and constrains governing possibilities going forward. And so what we need to look at are key policy feedback mechanisms, and that is the extent to which reforms change or fail to change the identities and affiliations of constituencies, and the degree to which different constituencies make investments themselves predicated on the expectation that this new policy will continue. when we see businesses and families organizing their lives around the expectation that government is going to do certain things, and they vote that way, and they think about politics that way, well then, candidates have to take that into account, and it becomes very risky for them to try to upset those long plans, right, of citizens. Some policies can have very powerful effects, and others may not have very powerful effects. So here is a typology that I use in the book to try to sort out a variety of different kinds of post-enactment reform trajectories. Why are some reforms there's a high probability they will be reversed or eroded, and other reforms have a higher probability of, in fact, sticking and indeed reconfiguring the dynamic. When we see the group identities and affiliations, and here I'm talking about constituency groups, when they are stable, that is to say, there's no change before and after the reform. There's no change at all. The same groups that liked the particular policy continue to like it, and same policies that didn't like it. And when we see group investments being modest, in other words, people, businesses, families are not really putting their own money or their own resources at stake on the expectation that reform's going to continue, there's a high probability of reversal, because this reform is not rooted in society now. Nobody is really organizing their lives around the expectation that this reform is going to continue. When we see the combination of fluidity in groups, but nobody is really heavily invested, that, I argue, is when we may see the erosion of a reform. The original reform may stay on the books, but there's going to be new public policies that are going to continue to be adopted in future years that may have very different purposes, right? That they may be antithetical. And I argue when we see stable and extensive investments, we see the reform having a high probability of being entrenched. And then the most powerful kind of effect, the rarest and the most powerful effect, is what I call a reconfiguration. And that is when the reform causes new coalitional alignments to emerge, new interest groups to come into the scene that were previously not in that sector. And we see new bargaining patterns, new lobbying patterns, new pressures coming, impinging on government, and those new actors are investing in the reform, in their own lives. Now, the whole arena has changed. This is another day. It's not easy to go back. This is, as we would say in America, this is a new ball game, right? This is a new day here. The policy sector has thoroughly been reconfigured, and it would be extremely difficult to resurrect the status quo ante, because all the political pressures impinging on that sector have fundamentally changed, and it would not be in the government's interest to try to change it. So, to give you a feel for what I'm talking about, I want to illustrate some of these arguments by looking at a couple of cases, and one of them I want to look at is airline deregulation in the United States. Now, airline deregulation occurred in 1978. This was prior to airline deregulation. The government regulated the airlines in the United States. They decided where the carriers could fly, how much they could charge, and as a result of that, prices were quite high on average. It was quite nice if you were a business traveler and your company was picking up your fare. And in fact, the only way the airlines competed, because they couldn't compete on routes or price, was on service. And so the service in the old days was really nice. And they used to have, piano bars, I'm told, in the 747s, and Playboy bunnies were serving the cocktails. It was an age that, regrettably, I never saw. But what was very bad about this policy, the old regulated system, was travel was expensive. Ordinary working class Americans and middle class families, it was very pricey. And America, like Australia, is a very big country, and we're a very mobile country. And we live in Virginia, and my kids' grandparents live in Colorado, and I'd like them to be able to see each other, and we don't want to pay business fare all the time. And so what happened was that economists made the case for airline deregulation on the merits. This was a pure instance of sort of microeconomic efficiency, that the market would work. This was a contestable market, and we can see more efficiency, and that on average fares are going to be better. And the advocates for that reform, of course, could not actually say to the American public, well, you know, the regulated airline system has a lot of deadweight losses, and we believe that if we apply Chicago pricing, it's going to, that's not going to, it wasn't sold that way at all. It was sold symbolically. It was sold as, this was during the 70s, and there was a lot of concern about big government at the time. This was deregulation, let's get the heavy hand of the government off the market, right? That the market can work here. And so it was packaged, and it was also, importantly, this was very important, it was sold as a solution to inflation. We had high double-digit inflation in the 70s. Now, most economists at the time would argue that the regulation of the airlines was actually not that big a contributor to overall inflation in the United States. But you could argue on the margin it would help a little bit, so there was enough credibility there, and inflation was a very salient issue in 1978, and so politicians were looking for something, anything they could do, right? And so we saw political entrepreneurship. We saw Ted Kennedy, his then aide, Stephen Breyer, who's now on the Supreme Court, worked on this, and Alfred Kahn, who was an economist and a professor. And importantly, this was very controversial. All the airlines, the big carriers, they didn't want change. Why would they want change? They had practically guaranteed profits. They were almost like utilities, right? It was very cushy. And they said, well, if we do this, it's going to be terrible, and you know, we're all going to fall apart, and it's also airline safety, and we're going to have a lot of crashes, and we've got these hijackings, and who knows where that goes, and we cannot do this. And they're very powerful and well organized. And they fought, you know, tooth and nail to stop airline deregulation, as did the labor unions, because the workers were getting very high wages in this heavily regulated sector where they did not face market competition. And so it passed, but it passed overwhelmingly, 363 to 8 in the House, which is amazing, and 83 to 9 in the Senate. So the puzzle that I ask here is, why has airline deregulation persisted? Why has this one stuck? And it is indeed a puzzle for several reasons. First of all, the issues that prompted deregulation